word of the Lord came to me, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that walks on the face of the earth. The word of the Lord came to me, do not be afraid, Abram, for I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great. The word of the Lord came to me, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. The word of the Lord came to me in a time when the word of the Lord was rare. See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. The word of the Lord came to me. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. In the beginning, the word of the Lord came to the darkness and the formless void. The word of the Lord came, and finally there was light. The word of the Lord has been speaking to God's people since the beginning of the world. Since the beginning, the word of the Lord has been creating, calling, shaping, reshaping, instructing, comforting, healing. So what is the Lord speaking to us today? The psalmist writes, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. The beautiful sunsets, the starry skies, the stormy rains, those puppy white things that are capable of producing thunder and hail and lightning and rain. The heavens of mystery that captivate our eyes in awestruck wonder. All were created by the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord is the set of hands with which God has fashioned our world. Now our world is drowning in a sea of words. Words are abundant in our culture, coming from every direction. From newspaper, television, magazine, the internet, the lips of both friends and foe. Do words hold power anymore? By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their hosts by the breath of his mouth. I wonder about the imagination of God. If I breathe this way, a sun will be formed. And if I breathe this way, clouds. And if I breathe this way, stunning stars will appear in the night sky. As God tinkered and played and discovered, God realized the miraculous work that could be created through the spoken word. I wonder about the imagination of God speaking into our lives. At creation, God uttered speech, and suddenly there became the brilliant splendor of God's majesty on full display. Daily, God utters speech into our lives, and there before us is the same brilliant splendor of God's majesty on full display. Do we see it? Do we see it? Do we take the time to catch it? What was God doing before the creation of our world? We don't know. I wonder if there was a great deal of thinking, of listening, of contemplating, of dreaming, of silence. Genesis says that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. It is as if the Spirit of God is practicing the discipline of solitude and silence. Richard Foster writes, though silence sometimes involves the absence of speech, it always involves the act of listening. The purpose of silence and solitude is to be able to see and hear. What if, before speaking the first words of creation, the Spirit of God, while hovering, was listening to the formless void and the darkness to see if they had anything to say? Do darkness and void have anything to say? Helmut Thielicke writes, truly the silence of God is different from that of men. The silence of God is not of indifference. It is the silence of higher thoughts. It does not imply a silent destiny. Perhaps you are in a place in which you wish the word of the Lord would come to you. God's silence has been deafening far too long, and you dream of the day when hope will break through the darkness of your despair. And finally, the word of the Lord will speak something, anything, into creation out of your chaos. If you are in that place, remember that before the word of the Lord spoke light and creation into being, the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the chaos of the seas and was not swept away by them. That is, before the word of the Lord spoke, the Spirit of the Lord was present, moving about in silence, brooding, thinking, dwelling, listening, preparing to do one of the most miraculous things yet. The same breath or spirit that brooded over the waters of Genesis 1, listening to what they might have to say, is the same breath that broods over the deep abysses of our souls, listening and hearing our deepest cries and groanings, and waiting for the moment when God's breath can finally speak words of comfort and life into God's people. The word of the Lord may not have come yet for you, my friend, but the Spirit of the Lord is present. In the meantime, join the Spirit in listening and in waiting. Lean into the silence. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle. Now, I have a counselor who is wonderful and helps me make sense of the world a whole lot better. And in one session with her, she had me to create in my imagination a container to put all of the grossness and the yuck from my soul, all of the things that cause me anxiety. So in my head, I created this imaginary freezer container, because I love food and just naturally resort to that sort of thinking. And so I tried as hard as I could to pull all of the grossness and yuck from my soul and stuff it into this container. Then she said we had to put a lid on it. So we put the lid on it, but we had to glue it and nail it and bolt it shut to make sure that it would stay on and that only I could open it. Then we put it on the shelf for safekeeping until it was a good time for me to take it out piece by piece and deal with it. And then we took a long piece of blue masking tape, stuck it to the side, and in big Sharpie marker we wrote, "For Michelle's healing only." I think that God not only bottles up the oceans that God's hands have created, I think God also takes in God's hands all of the oceans of our sadness, chaos, affliction, and suffering, and bottles them up, labeling them for the healing of my child only. And when God bottles those things up, they can consume us no more. And then when God takes those things off the shelf and begins to deal with them in ways that are good for us, the oceans that once swallowed us suddenly become the beach sand between our toes. And we find peace. It's hot in here, y'all. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their hosts by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle. He put the deeps in storehouses. If one were so educated, one should study this text using the original Hebrew language, seeing as how I prefer the Greek language. And, Old Testament Hebrew, it's all Greek to me anyway, so I use the Septuagint. The Greek word that is here translated deeps is abusus, which easily translated means abyss. A bottomless, unbounded pit that is usually reserved for the dead. The Greek word here translated storehouses is thesauros, which could also be translated the place in which good and precious things are collected and laid up, a receptacle fit for the protection of precious things. So why does this linguistic lesson matter? Well, first we can note that the translators saw God as caring deeply for the oceans that God's hands had created, carefully placing the deep unknown into a receptacle fit for the protection of precious things. It also means that the abysses of our lives in which we often find ourselves drowning, the pits that make us feel like we belong among the dead, those are likewise taken with care and placed by the hands of a loving God into a receptacle fit for precious things. In other words, they are marked and sealed with the statement, "For the healing of my child only." The things in which we find ourselves drowning, the parts of us that seem like nothing but deep, mysterious emptiness, those are the parts of us that God calls precious. Those are the parts of us that God gathers into storehouses for safekeeping and our well-being. Those are the places over which the Spirit of God hovers and into which the Word of God speaks life. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their hosts by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle. He put the deeps in storehouses. Roger Nishioka, a professor of Christian education at Columbia Theological Seminary, once said, "Language creates reality." His point was that we use words not only to describe what already exists, but our words hold the power to create what will be. This will be called a cell phone, and so it is. This will be called the internet, and so it is. This will be called a selfie, and so it is. Language creates reality. But it's also true for our intangible culture. For many years it was said, blacks and whites cannot live together in the same society, and so it was. Many years I was told women cannot preach, and so it was for me. Language creates reality. So if language creates reality, and if by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, what are we creating with our words? Or our silence? When we hear the cries of refugees fleeing their home country in search of a welcoming place of peace, what are we creating with our words? Or our silence? When we hear the news telling us once again that another mass shooting has occurred, what are we creating with our words? Or our silence? When we hear that yet another African American has lost his life at the hands of police brutality, what are we creating with our words? Or our silence? When someone we love looks us in the eye and tells us that she's suffering from mental illness, what are we creating with our words? Or our silence? Words that we have spoken or failed to speak in the past have the power to haunt us. But words also have the power to redeem. That's what we see in the Word made flesh, who redeems both our misspoken words and our suffocating silences. May we, the people of God, allow the God of creation to stir in us the spirit of imagination, that we might tinker and discover what new realities we can help create in God's beautiful world. So breathe in. Now what?